Welcome, Professor Jennifer Welsh, Canada 150 Chair at McGill University, newly arrived, or almost a year now, from European Policy Institute, and has got some fantastic, very interesting projects. But more than that, Jennifer is one of Canada's leading international relations scholars, and it is really great to have you in Montreal.
Thank you.
I want to talk about a project that you initiated when you were at Oxford and then at the European Policy Institute, this Individualization of War. And it sounds like a fascinating project. Could you briefly describe what it is, who were the funders, and what did you come out with?
Sure. So the Individualization of War came out some work I had been doing in Oxford at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. And it was an interdisciplinary study, which is actually very hard to do.
Yes,
People talk about it, but it's very hard to do.
Yes.
With lawyers, IR scholars, and moral philosophers. And what we wanted to do was look at the impact of the changes in war, both in practice and in scholarship, that give increased focus to individuals rather than collectives.
Yes.
So we started from the premise that these changes may or may not be desirable. We're not going to necessarily focus on that, but what impact are those changes having?
Mm-hmm.
Some of the pressures for individualization come from normative advancements,
True.
most notably human rights agendas.
Just war and traditions.
Yes, exactly, and the increased place of human rights law in the context of armed conflict, rather than purely international humanitarian law. And some of the changes are, of course, technological.
Yes.
So with increased precision, we can target individuals
You
more
don't need to do
precisely.
carpet bombing. Yes.
Exactly. So we look at the impact of individualization in three main areas. Firstly, in the realm of protection.
Right.
So how is this quest to protect individuals, rather than to go to war simply for reasons of state, or rather than to conduct peacekeeping simply to keep warring factions apart,
Right.
but to actually protect individuals and civilians, what kind of challenges has that created for policy actors
Globally.
globally? So we look at the challenges for national militaries, for humanitarian agencies, and for international organizations like the UN.
Yes.
And then the second area is on liability. So liability to harm. So what does this increased capacity and willingness to target individuals, how has that changed some of our ethical and legal frameworks around war? And then finally, to be probably the area we're all most familiar with, accountability. So how is this move to create greater accountability for individuals in how they act in war affecting, again,
And this is connected to international human rights tribunal, all that kind of stuff.
Yes, to advancements in international criminal law.
Right.
So we looked at those three domains: protection, liability, and accountability. And the focus of our work was really trying to understand the dilemmas that individualization poses.
Yes.
So we didn't necessarily treat it as an unmitigated good, although some of our team members were more kind of normatively
Yes,
connected to individualization.
Yeah.
And nor did we see it as a finished process,
No,
right?
of
It's
course,
like
yeah.
globalization.
Yeah, the technological advancement.
It's a trend, but we see ebbs and flows, and how is it being contested? And even in the course of the project,
Yeah.
which was 5 years, we saw the terrain changing. So what we thought at the beginning and what we thought at the end evolved. And you asked about funding. It was funded by the European Research Council.
Yes. So that's very impressive. You mentioned the change in the 5-year period, but the changes for the good, or you found changes, some of them not so good, or countries playing around like great powers, United States, Russia, China, for instance?
So changes in two respects, I think. One, the way in which individualization was being contested. So I think when we began the project, we would see more questions about, was it applicable in a particular case? Not whether the striving for individual protection or individual accountability was good or bad, but could we always pursue that in every context?
Yeah.
Whereas by the end of the project, the contestation was much more direct. Is it actually even possible or desirable to think about individuals in the context of armed conflict? Isn't it what some would call a profoundly collective game, either between combatants and non-combatants, or states or warring parties? So you had a pushback of a much more fundamental kind, I think by the end of the 5-year period, linked to the tensions and erosions of the liberal international order.
Yes, and the populist rise of populism. That generates a question, the connection with the responsibility to protect, which you've been very involved, R2P or whatever it's called. Do you see a connection there, and how is it implemented in these things in the legal world? Are judges, international lawyers looking at it as a plausible way of applying to their cases, or is it more for decision makers to consider rather than
Right,
apply?
yeah, very good question. So responsibility to protect was one of the principles that we looked at within the protection domain of the project. We also looked at the delivery of humanitarian assistance.
That's right.
We also looked at peacekeeping. But it was one of the elements of that research. And I think the key starting point for looking at responsibility to protect was to recognize it wasn't a legal principle. It was conceived by heads of state and government to reaffirm existing legal commitments, but not to create new law.
Right.
So to reaffirm the importance of the Geneva Convention's principles that outlaw war crimes, to reaffirm the Genocide Convention, the prohibition of crimes against humanity. So it was designed to mobilize action, to raise the cost of inaction, but also to build institutional capacity to protect populations more effectively. And I think, to your point, to have an impact on decision making, an impact on diplomacy, that there would be efforts in these situations to try to find common ground on how to respond.
I'm curious to know whether there are any pushbacks of the militaries or national security apparatuses of, for instance, the Pentagon. They've adapted some, but I can imagine a situation where the military say, okay, we can't follow all this. The fog of war is such that you have to use force sometimes, and the weapons we are inventing are not going to be all the time meant to protect, even though we are supposed. So do you notice there is a considerable debate, say, take the case of the US Pentagon, Defense Department. People are engaging this, or they are trying to come up with excuses not to implement?
Yeah, very good question. So I think I'd answer you in two ways. Firstly, the responsibility to protect as a principle was designed to encompass a range of measures.
Right.
Starting from preventive measures, but even as you move closer to a crisis, diplomatic, political, humanitarian tools.
Yes.
So it was trying to open up the toolbox so that force would be a last resort, not a first resort.
Right.
But secondly, when you need, or it's deemed to be necessary to use military force, how is it that you do so? And I think there, the reaction of established militaries has been, on the one hand, very open in that they have been willing to discuss how do we adapt doctrines so that we actually are offering more effective protection. But on the other hand, to question whether you can always prioritize protection over military necessity. If it differs hugely whether you're in a peacekeeping context or whether you're in a war context. It's also, I think, reignited the old debate that we saw prior to the development of responsibility to protect, which we saw in Kosovo, over whether you can actually protect from the air, right? Whether you can simply create safe areas, no-fly zones, or whether in order to deliver meaningful protection, you have to have boots on the ground. And of course, the willingness to do that in our contemporary system is extremely limited. And the Kosovo experience left left us with a great deal of uncertainty as to whether that's an appropriate transfer of risk, protecting from the air.
We mentioned technology. There's a lot of concern that the AI, for instance, will give countries the capability to, and drones, for instance, all kinds of warfare that they are not used to. These artificial soldiers engaging in, mass operations without fear of being retributed or attacked back, because even if they attack back, they can get lost, sort of thing. What does that mean for warfare? And in this context, for instance, if countries implement these new technologies into mass level, kind of new revolutionary military affairs, implement them, will that affect the way they will fight the war? Because that gives them an advantage. Whoever has got the mass number of the swarming soldiers, the artificial soldiers.
Yeah, I think when I think about these technological changes, there's always, I think, a danger of us assuming that every challenge is completely novel.
Right.
Whereas if we step back and we look at the evolution of the law of armed conflict in particular, we see that technological change has always been part of the story.
Yes.
But it is the case with, particularly if we look at UAVs, unmanned autonomous vehicles or drones.
Yes.
Here we're not yet in the world of robots. We kind of stopped our analysis there. I wish we had all the time.
Yes.
But when we looked at drones, what we saw that there were two interesting effects on the legal and normative framework.
Right.
So on the one hand, drones, the capacity for targeted killing, loosened or shaped the definition of who is a non-combatant in an armed conflict. So if you recall, that's the crucial distinction. Are you a combatant or a non-combatant? And what we have seen through technology, but also through some of the ethics of war in recent years, is an opening up of that non-combatant or civilian category. And a line of thinking that says not all non-combatants are equally innocent.
Yes.
And perhaps some non-combatants should be liable to be killed. Political leaders of non-state armed groups. So that's an erosion of a key principle in the law of armed conflict that technology has contributed to. If we think about the controversy that surrounded Obama with his targeted killing campaign, it was the discovery of information that all fighting-aged males in a particular vicinity were deemed to be combatants, when in fact that was a very questionable calculation.
Yes,
right?
it is. And in fact, it is against the notion of chivalry.
Yeah.
You're just using your advantage to kill the guy who's innocent or walking around.
And the other, just very quickly, TV, the other effect I think it's had, and this is when it's hard to know which direction it will go, is you could argue that it erodes the restraint of last resort. Right? So we've always had the use of force as a last resort, necessity. But if you have means at your disposal that are lethal, but their effects are very contained, they're very targeted, are you more likely to rush to lethal means more quickly?
Yes.
And I think that's a very interesting question to ask.
It's actually relevant in the nuclear context.
For sure,
Development of mini nukes, the argument against it is that once you know you can restrict the impact, the area of impact, you may use it, and in that process you may tarnish the whole traditional non-use or taboo. And so that was the argument against the development of usable, quote-unquote, mini nukes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think this is a very interesting, fascinating area. But one thing that really bothers those who are in this sort of realist camp is, these are things the great powers want, and they come up with whatever is good for them, but they break them if they can, just like we talk about international law, or the critics talk about. What do you think of that problem of this great power manipulation? Or power determines the kind of choices countries make, and also they come up with new technologies, new ideas to circumvent if necessary, like we mentioned the way the US targeted the terrorists. And the rising powers, China and in particular Russia, doesn't seem often following the international legal principles on territoriality and things like that. So where do you put great power politics in this?
Yeah, I think it has a very, very central place. But we look at it in two ways. So one is to acknowledge and study the ways in which power has been intricately connected to the development of normative agendas.
Sure.
And at times those configurations of power are not always what you would expect. The coalitions that push particular norms forward.
Yes.
So for example, on responsibility to protect, it was actually, curiously, it's been a principle and norm that the United States has always been reluctant to embrace.
Yes.
For reasons that are very historical. So the idea of responsibility, that there is a mechanism or means for which the United States can be held responsible or restrained in advance from using force or not using force in the way that it deems fit. It's a long-standing U.S. concern. It goes back to the defeat of the League of Nations in Wilson's time, right? So the U.S. has supported linked normative concepts. It's been a leader in genocide prevention. It created inside the machinery of the U.S. government an atrocities prevention board. But yet, the idea of a responsibility to protect, it has always been very reluctant.
Doesn't want to be legally bound.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think what's also been interesting, and this is not unique to the principles that we study, is the way in which the great powers seek to instrumentalize.
Yes.
Just as they have with notions of self-defense
Yes.
in the past. So we've seen Russia, for example, invoking the responsibility to protect in interesting cases, but that being contested. I think another way in which it's been interesting is to see over time how rising powers have felt more enabled to shape the meaning of norms. And I think China is a great example here. So the responsibility to protect principle was built on three pillars. First and foremost, that states have the primary responsibility to protect their populations from atrocity crimes. Secondly, that the international community should assist states to fulfill their protection responsibilities through traditional diplomatic, political, development assistance. And then thirdly, only if a state is manifestly failing to protect can international actors come in. What China has been doing very creatively within a UN context is focusing on the first pillar and claiming that what the success of responsibility to protect hinges on is the capacities of states to be strong enough to protect their own populations. Now this is technically appealing, right? The idea that yes, we need strong states, but we need to recognize how that can also affect the implementation of that principle, because it does re-elevate the sovereignty frame. And so it is just an example for us about how norms do not have fixed and absolute meanings. And now rising powers feel much more able, much more legitimate in their efforts to try to shape the meanings of norms. And I think we're going to see this across the board, also with development assistance, also with national paths to human rights protection, right?
But their critics would say that, look at the cases where it was applied, basically if you African leaders, weak states, none of the advanced countries, you have cases of peacekeepers not performing their responsibilities, or even the US initiating somewhat of an unjust war. None of them will ever be caught, even though we can say an unjust war is an unjust war, whether it is started by the US or somebody else. And so that challenge still remains, and powerful states somehow manage to get away with whatever they do. I mean, that's a common criticism. I'm not saying I share it, but
I think it is a powerful criticism. And I mean, if we look at the military action on the part of the United States in Iraq, that was not a war for responsibility to protect.
No, it wasn't.
But you're absolutely correct in saying that that war cast a shadow over states from around the globe, their views on trying to create a new regime in which force could be used for humanitarian purposes. They were very reluctant because of the fear of abuse. Right? What's fascinating and frustrating about the way that responsibility to protect was articulated is that the coercive means for its implementation, if all other means are not being used or they've failed, states wanted to place those coercive means in the hands of the United Nations Security Council within the existing collective security mechanisms of the Charter. Now, we might ask, if you're Brazil or if you're India, why would you do that? This is a body that does not have representation, which has arguably a legitimacy deficit. But the reason at the end, well, the reasons are multiple, but one of the reasons is this fear of legitimizing the unilateral use of force. That this is the one multilateral check we have. And so at the moment, just like all uses of force not in self-defense, we are beholden to the existing collective security mechanism. So I found it fascinating in my work on responsibility to protect that in discussions or statements that states would make, they would often couple their views on responsibility to protect with their frustrations about the composition of the Security Council, right? Brazil would never miss an opportunity to make that point at the same time that it was giving its view.
We are not questioning the Security Council, but we wanted a representative, democratic. So the collective legitimation is very important for them. One of the other problem is you have these new political dynamics, illiberal democracies emerging. And if you look at the behavior of some of these countries internally, for instance, China with the Uyghurs, India with the Muslims in Kashmir and other places, they are really moving away from some of these norms, democratic norms, and the protection internally using sovereignty principle and national security. I don't think the responsibility to protect concept has been applied to these domestic situations where there is suppression going on, or Turkey, Iran,
It's a very good question you raise. So it depends what we mean by apply. So it's certainly the case that if you look at efforts that exist in civil society and in some academic institutions to assess on an ongoing basis where the risks of atrocity crimes are globally. Those cases that you've cited are mentioned. So we have now, partly as a result of the responsibility to protect principle, but also because of the ongoing academic work on genocide, we have a much better sense today of what the risk factors are and a much greater interest in trying to have a system of early warning and prevention. So there are assessments that show us the societies that are at risk, and you have civil society organizations who point to the situation of the Uyghurs in China and elsewhere. But there's a distinction to be made from who's at risk and what kind of measures can we and should we take to respond, right? That's a second question. So there has been discussion in circles that work on atrocity crimes, both academically and in civil society and even within a UN framework, about these cases, because there was a real effort to try to galvanize early warning. But how you should respond, what are the tools at your disposal, we can't deny that some of these contexts are much more difficult to have any form of engagement. And so that is our greatest challenge.
But one thing though, many of them are, especially the rising powers, are sensitive to status depreciation. For India, for instance, if the world media picks it up, like the New York Times, so they are sensitive to it because that affects their quest for global status. So the best way probably is to link up to their own interest in becoming responsible great powers in the future. And that has to be done domestically too, which is always hard.
Yes, and also through non-coercive means, right? If we rush to always engaging in overt shaming
Yes.
and coercion,
Very true.
it makes it extremely difficult
They become
to
defensive.
engage.
Yeah.
But if you think about
Yes.
the push within the UN system at the moment for preventive diplomacy,
Yes.
there is an attempt and an agenda which is trying to identify policy mechanisms for engaging countries earlier in a way that is not seen as intrusive.
Right.
Because when we think about the cases you just mentioned, it's often said that the use of military force is the ultimate infringement of sovereignty. And of course it is, but some of the preventive measures you might want to take to address a situation are also can be seen by these countries as sovereignty threatening.
Yes.
Prevention is also controversial.
Yes, yes.
And so how you find a way to engage without being accused of illegitimate intervention, it's extremely difficult. And some of the best special representatives of the Secretary General or other organizations are those that are somehow able to do that with states that are in early crisis
Their personality.
through it is personality, it's experience, it's connections, and figuring out who has leverage in any given situation, because it will not be the same person all the time.
Yes. So that brings me to our final question, which is, you had a great experience as the special representative for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. You were advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada. Which Prime Minister was that?
Paul Martin.
Paul Martin. And on some of these issues. And people who are in academic world often say we don't have much influence, and you are actually disproving that you can influence policy making. What's your advice? What's your experience in that process? What did you find out, whether these policy makers are open to our ideas, or they find us too theoretical, or how do we address this issue of policy, or bridging the gap, as Alexander George puts it, between the policy world and theory world?
Well, it's an old challenge. We've been accused of this in our profession for a long time, and there's been very few people that seemingly cross those worlds, although perhaps more than we realize.
Yes.
And I guess I would say two things. One is that we do need to, within the academy, make greater efforts to try to present our work not in bullet points that tells policymakers exactly what to do, but in ways that show them what different options look like in tangible terms, right? So if we are to take a certain approach, what will that look like? Can you play out the implications?
The consequences, yeah.
That's what we often fail to do. And I think there we can do a lot more. Some of our colleagues who work with large amounts of data do a great service in just magnifying and illustrating the nature and scope of problems. And I think that in and of itself, if you are a good communicator, can often be enough.
And you present it in an easy
Exactly.
fashion. Yeah.
But I think what we need to do is to be able to really spell out the implications and the consequences of taking certain kinds of actions, or if not specific actions, approaches to resolving problems.
Yeah. So I think our discipline has a lot to offer, but somehow we are now into different domains, different theories, different paradigms, not reaching the right people.
Yeah. And I think the other is that we should resist the temptation to be answering only the questions that the policymakers tell us we should be answering. That there is so much value in our distance, in being the voice that actually suggests new issues, that isn't just following what they are interested in,
coming up with,
but actually to point over the horizon. You're not thinking about this now, but you should be thinking about it because
the long-term implications.
And that, I think many of us who have wanted to be engaged in the policy world have erred on the side of wanting to be relevant, and therefore not thinking ahead, not looking beyond. We need to be thinking of the questions they should be asking themselves.
We need to be big thinkers. So
Yeah.
Jennifer, thank you so much. It was a great pleasure, and hopefully we can continue this conversation at some other point. And wish you all the best with your work.